One of these three brake fluids is Ford's own factory specification for this exact truck. It is the fluid the dealership installs at every service interval, the fluid the engineers who designed the brake system selected, and the fluid that carries the full weight of OEM credibility behind it. After 12 months of independent lab testing inside the same F-150, it did not produce the best results. What came out on top was not what the brand recognition suggested, and the fluid that produced the worst moisture numbers did it quietly, with no warning, no soft pedal, and nothing visible that would have told an owner anything was wrong until the grade got steep enough to matter. Most F-150 owners change their engine oil on schedule and treat their brake fluid as a permanent fixture. Pour it in once, forget it exists, and assume the system is fine because the pedal feels the same as it did the day they bought the truck. But brake fluid does not stay the same. It cannot. The chemistry of how it works is also the chemistry of how it degrades, and by the time that degradation becomes noticeable at the pedal, the fluid has already been compromised for months. The question this test was designed to answer is which of these three fluids degrades the slowest under the real conditions an F-150 sees, and the answer has implications for every truck owner who tows with any regularity. The three fluids are Valvoline Syn Power DOT34, Motorcraft DOT4, and Lucas DOT4. All three meet the FMVSS 116 DOT4 specification. All three are polyethylene glycol ether-based hydraulic fluids. Motorcraft retails at approximately $7 to $10 per quart and is Ford's OEM specification for the F-150 brake system. Valvoline Syn Power runs $6 to $9 and carries both DOT3 and DOT4 ratings. Lucas DOT4 sits at $8 to $12 per quart and is marketed around high temperature performance and extended service life. On the shelf, these bottles look nearly interchangeable. Inside a brake system that is working through 12 months of heat cycles, humidity exposure, and towing loads, they do not perform the same way. If you want to support me, like this video, and let's dive in. Here is what actually separates these fluids at the chemistry level, because the DOT4 rating on the label is a floor, not a ceiling, and it tells you almost nothing about how a fluid performs as it ages. Brake fluid is hygroscopic by design. It absorbs moisture from the atmosphere continuously, permeating through rubber brake hoses and seals at a molecular level. This is intentional. A fluid that absorbs moisture distributes it evenly throughout the system, preventing free water from pooling inside calipers and freezing in cold climates. But that same absorption is the mechanism of degradation. Every fraction of a % of water content that enters the fluid depresses its boiling point. A DOT4 fluid that starts with a dry boiling point of 500 degrees Fahrenheit can drop below the wet boiling point threshold of 311 degrees after 2 years of service. And below that threshold, on a loaded trailer descent, the margin between normal braking and vapor lock begins to close. Vapor lock in a brake system is not a gradual warning. It does not give the driver time to adjust. When fluid temperature inside a caliper exceeds the boiling point of the fluid, a gas bubble forms in the hydraulic line. Gas is compressible. Hydraulic fluid is not. The pedal goes soft, travel increases, and pressure at the caliper drops, at the exact moment the driver needs maximum stopping force. The 3% moisture content threshold is the point where brake specialists consider fluid service mandatory regardless of mileage, because above 3%, the boiling point depression is significant enough to make that scenario possible under hard use. Measuring how quickly each of these three fluids crosses that threshold under identical real-world conditions is the entire test. And the first lab interval produced a result that changed the direction of the conversation immediately. The first samples came back at 15,000 miles, and the copper numbers were the first variable that separated the field. Copper in used brake fluid is not just a contamination signal, it is a diagnostic for system health. Copper leaches from the brass fittings and copper-lined steel brake lines as fluid acidity increases over time. Elevated copper means the fluid's buffering capacity is depleting and acid is beginning to accumulate, which accelerates corrosion of every metal component in the hydraulic circuit. Motorcraft copper at the first interval, 14 parts per million. Valvoline SynPower, 11 parts per million. Lucas, 9 parts per million. Moisture content at interval 1 told a parallel story. Motorcraft came in at 1.4% water by weight, Valvoline at 1.2%, Lucas at 1.1%. No fluid had crossed the 3% service threshold, but the direction of those moisture numbers, and especially the copper readings, pointed at something worth watching in the intervals ahead. Interval 2 is where a moisture reading stops being a baseline and starts being a trend that demands attention. At 30,000 miles of cumulative exposure, Motorcraft moisture content had climbed to 2.1%. Valvoline came in at 1.8%. Lucas held at 1.4%. Copper on Motorcraft rose to 22 parts per million, the only fluid in the test to move upward on both moisture and copper simultaneously between intervals. Valvoline copper reached 16. Lucas copper held at 12. That Motorcraft copper movement between interval 1 and interval 2 was not noise. A fluid that absorbs moisture faster than its competitors is also acidifying faster, and a fluid that is acidifying faster is corroding the system it was specified to protect. The OEM label on the bottle does not change what the lab spectrometer reports back. An additive package that shows accelerating depletion signals at the second interval is not the fluid you want protecting a brake system that is still 12 to 18 months away from its next scheduled service. We pulled caliper temperature logs throughout the test using a contact thermocouple mounted to the rear caliper housing on the driver's side, the position that consistently generates the highest thermal load under trailer tow. During a sustained mountain descent in July, running a 6,200-pound trailer load with an outdoor ambient temperature of 88 degrees, caliper surface temperatures peaked at 291 degrees Fahrenheit. That is the operating range where boiling point margin stops being a specification and starts being the variable that determines whether the pedal stays firm or goes soft under the driver's foot. At that temperature, the gap between a fluid at 1.4% moisture and a fluid at 2.1% moisture is not academic. It is the difference between available pressure at the caliper and a compressible column of vapor where hydraulic fluid is supposed to be. At peak caliper temperature during that descent, the boiling point margin on each fluid became the number that defined the test. Lucas, at 1.4% moisture content at interval 2, retained a calculated wet boiling point margin that kept it well above the vapor threshold under the measured thermal load. Valvoline at 1.8% retained adequate margin but with less headroom. Motorcraft at 2.1% moisture and the highest copper reading in the test showed the smallest remaining margin between operating temperature and the point where vapor formation becomes possible. The fluid Ford specified for this truck absorbed moisture faster than the two aftermarket alternatives, and on the grade where that margin mattered most, it had the least of it left. Here is the number that makes the price argument disappear entirely. Lucas .4 costs approximately $2 to $4 more per quart than Motorcraft at typical retail. The F-150 brake system holds approximately 1 quart of fluid. A full system flush uses between 1 and 1.5 quarts. The total cost difference between the highest and lowest performing fluid in this test across a full system flush is less than $6. A single brake caliper replacement on an F-150 starts at $150 in parts and routinely reaches $300 to $500 with labor at an independent shop. An ABS modulator, which is the component most directly exposed to long-term fluid acidity and copper contamination, runs between $400 and $900, depending on whether a remanufactured unit is available. The fluid that produced the best moisture retention and the lowest copper trend across the entire test costs less than a fast food meal, more per flush, than the fluid that produced the worst numbers on both metrics. Intervals 3 through 6 continued without deviation from the pattern established at interval 2. Lucas moisture content at the final interval, 2.1%, still below the 3% service threshold at 30,000 miles of cumulative exposure. Valvoline finished at 2.4%. Motorcraft finished at 2.8%, the closest of the three to the service threshold at the same accumulated mileage. Copper on Lucas at the final interval, 17 parts per million. Valvoline, 23. Motorcraft, 31, the highest copper reading in the test at every single interval from interval 2 onward. 31 parts per million of copper in brake fluid at a 2-year service mark means the hydraulic system has been operating with measurable acid accumulation for most of that service period. That accumulation does not reverse when the fluid is changed. The corrosion it causes is already present in the metal components it contacted. After 12 months, 6 independent lab reports, and a thermal stress event on a loaded mountain descent, here is what the data produced. Motorcraft DOT4, Ford's own OEM specification for this truck, absorbed moisture faster, acidified faster, and generated more copper contamination than either aftermarket alternative across every interval after the first. The OEM designation guarantees seal compatibility and formulation baseline. It does not guarantee the best moisture resistance in its class. Valvoline SynPower performed better than Motorcraft on both primary metrics and represents a meaningful upgrade for owners who use the truck for mixed driving without regular heavy towing. Lucas DOT4 held the lowest moisture content, the lowest copper readings, and the largest boiling point margin at peak thermal load across the full test duration. For a truck that tows, operates in temperature extremes, or runs toward the outer edge of a 2-year service interval, the chemistry that the lab samples documented was not close. If you want to see how these same 3 fluids perform in the clutch master cylinder on a manual-equipped truck under the same test protocol, that comparison is already underway. Subscribe so the results reach you when they come in.